Have you ever imagined that road trip you've been planning for months going terribly wrong? Picture this. Stranded in the middle of a dark, desolate road with no cell signal, no help, and feeling completely defenseless. What would you do? How would you protect your friends or loved ones? In tonight's stories, we explore two such harrowing situations, each more desperate than the last. These are tales of ordinary people trapped in utterly horrifying circumstances, something that could happen to anyone. What would you do in their place? Prepare yourself for a journey beyond the ordinary, into the shadows of your deepest fears. Welcome to the world of Mr. Scary Guy. It was the summer of 2017, and my friends and I decided to take a road trip across the country. We had just graduated from college and wanted to do something memorable before starting our careers. There were 4 of us: Harry, Jenna, Brad, and me, Anthony. We packed up Jenna's SUV and set off from our hometown in California, aiming to reach the East Coast in about 2 weeks. The first few days were uneventful. We visited national parks, camped under the stars, and made countless memories. Everything was going perfectly until we reached New Mexico. We had planned to take a detour to visit some lesser-known attractions, but that's when things started to go wrong. We were driving on a desolate stretch of highway late at night when we realized we were low on gas. The nearest town was still miles away, and the last gas station we had passed was long behind us. Tension began to creep into our conversations as we debated whether to keep going or turn back. We decided to push forward, hoping to reach the town before we ran out of fuel. As we drove, the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. There were no other cars, no streetlights, just the faint glow of our headlights cutting through the night. Suddenly, Jenna, who was driving, slammed on the brakes. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, barely illuminated by our headlights. It was a man, wearing tattered clothes and looking disoriented.
Should we stop?
Jenna asked, her voice trembling.
We can't just leave him here.
Brad replied, always the compassionate one. Reluctantly, we agreed to help. Jenna rolled down her window slightly and called out to the man. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at us with vacant eyes. Something about him felt off, but we couldn't just drive away. We decided to get out and see if we could assist him. As we approached, the man suddenly collapsed to the ground. We rushed to his side, but when we got closer, we saw that his skin was pale and his eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky. It was clear he was dead. Panic set in. We had no idea what to do. We didn't have cell service, and there was no one around for miles. "We need to get back in the car and find help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We hurried back to the SUV, but just as we were about to get in, we heard a noise coming from the darkness. It was a low, guttural growl. We froze, scanning the area with our flashlights. Out of the shadows emerged a pack of wild dogs, their eyes glowing eerily in the beam of our lights.
Get in the car.
Harry shouted. We scrambled into the SUV, slamming the doors just as the dogs lunged at us. They clawed at the windows and barked ferociously, their teeth gnashing. Jenna floored the gas pedal, and we sped off, leaving the dogs behind. Our hearts were pounding, and we were all shaken by the encounter. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, until we finally saw the lights of a small town ahead. We pulled into a gas station, relieved to have found civilization. As we filled up the tank, an elderly man approached us. He looked at our terrified faces and asked if we were okay.
We found a dead man on the road back there.
Jenna stammered. The man's expression changed to one of concern.
"Where exactly did you see him?"
he asked. We described the location, and the man's face grew pale.
"You need to leave this place,"
he said urgently.
"That stretch of road is known around here. people disappear there. It's cursed.
We exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to believe him. But something about his tone convinced us to heed his warning. We thanked him and quickly got back on the road, deciding to drive through the night to put as much distance between us and that place as possible. The next day, we tried to put the incident behind us, but it was clear none of us could shake the feeling of dread. We continued our journey, but the mood had shifted. We were no longer carefree travelers. There was an unspoken fear that lingered in the air. A few nights later, we found ourselves on another remote highway, this time in Texas. We were all on edge, constantly scanning the road for any sign of danger. It was around midnight when we noticed a car following us. At first, we didn't think much of it, but as the miles passed, it became clear that the car was deliberately tailing us. Jenna sped up, hoping to lose them, but the car matched our speed. Panic set in as we realized we were being chased. We didn't know what they wanted, but we weren't about to find out. We drove faster, weaving through the narrow, winding roads, but the car stayed right behind us. "Take the next turn," I shouted, pointing to a dirt road that branched off the highway. Jenna swerved onto the road, and we bounced along the rough terrain. The car followed for a while, but eventually gave up and disappeared into the darkness. We drove until we found a secluded spot to stop and catch our breath. We were all shaken, our minds racing with fear and uncertainty. We decided to stay in the car for the rest of the night, too scared to set up camp. The next morning, we found our way back to the highway and continued our journey, but the sense of unease never left us. A few days later, we reached our final destination on the East Coast. We were exhausted, both physically and mentally. The road trip had taken a toll on us, and we were all ready to go home. As we drove back, we tried to make sense of everything that had happened, but there were no clear answers. A year passed, and we rarely talked about the trip. It was a dark chapter in our lives that we preferred to forget. But one night, I received a call from Harry. He sounded distressed and told me he had something to share. We met up, and he told me he had been doing some research about the road where we found the dead man. "I found a forum where people share their experiences on that stretch of road," Harry said, his voice trembling. "There are stories just like ours. People have seen the same man, encountered the same pack of dogs. Some never made it out." Chills ran down my spine as I listened to Harry. It was clear that we had encountered something beyond our understanding. We had been lucky to escape with our lives. To this day, I still think about that road trip and the horrors we faced. It's a reminder that there are things in this world that can't be explained, and sometimes it's best to leave the unknown alone. If you ever find yourself on a desolate highway, remember our story and think twice before stopping for a stranger in the night. It was in the middle of 2019 when my wife, Laylee, and I decided to take a road trip that we hoped would be a memorable adventure. Little did we know, it would turn out to be memorable for all the wrong reasons. We had been planning this trip for months, meticulously mapping out our route and making sure we had everything we needed for a smooth journey. Our plan was to drive from our hometown in Pennsylvania to a secluded cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, where we would spend a week hiking, fishing, and enjoying the tranquility of nature. We left early in the morning, our car packed with supplies and our spirits high. The drive was uneventful at first, filled with laughter, music, and the excitement of the open road. As we drove deeper into the mountains, the scenery became more remote and the roads narrower. It was around sunset when we realized we were running low on gas. I suggested we take a detour to a small town I had seen on the map, about 20 miles off our planned route. Laylee agreed, thinking it would be a quick stop. The road to the town was winding and poorly lit, with dense forests on either side. As we drove, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the darkness seemed to close in around us. We finally reached the town, which looked like something out of a forgotten era. The buildings were old and run down with faded signs and broken windows. There was no one in sight, and the only gas station we found appeared to be abandoned. Despite the eerie atmosphere, we decided to fill up the tank using one of the old-fashioned pumps. While I worked on the pump, Laylee went to look for a restroom. I stayed behind to keep an eye on our belongings. As I stood by the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of an old sign swinging in the breeze. After what felt like an eternity, Laylee returned, looking visibly shaken. She said she had found the restroom, but it was in a state of disrepair, and there were strange symbols carved into the walls. She also mentioned hearing whispers, but when she called out, no one answered. We quickly decided to leave, the unsettling feeling growing stronger by the minute. As we drove out of the town, the road became even more treacherous. The trees seemed to close in on us, their gnarled branches casting eerie shadows in the car's headlights. We tried to lighten the mood by telling jokes and sharing stories, but it was clear that both of us were on edge. Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered before dying completely. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no idea how to fix the car. I decided to check under the hood, hoping it was something I could easily fix. Laylee stayed inside the car, trying to keep warm. As the minutes ticked by, the darkness outside seemed to grow thicker, and the silence was only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves. Just when we were starting to think we might be spending the night in the car, we saw a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. A beat-up old truck pulled up alongside us, and an elderly man got out. He introduced himself as Earl and offered to help us with the car. We were hesitant, but we didn't have many options, so we accepted his offer. Earl tinkered with the engine for a while before declaring that he couldn't fix it here, but could tow us to his garage, which was a few miles back in the direction we had come. Desperate to get out of the woods, we agreed. Earl hitched our car to his truck, and we set off down the dark road. The ride was bumpy and slow, and the further we went, the more uneasy we became. Earl's garage was an old, dilapidated building surrounded by dense forest. There were no other buildings or signs of life around, just an eerie silence that made our skin crawl. Earl led us inside, where the smell of oil and rust filled the air. The garage was cluttered with old tools, car parts, and strange trinkets. Earl told us to make ourselves comfortable while he took a look at the car. We huddled together, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over us. After a while, Earl returned and said it would take a few hours to fix the car. He offered us a place to stay for the night in his guest house, which was a short walk from the garage. With no other options, we reluctantly agreed. Earl led us through a narrow path in the woods to a small, run-down cabin. It was musty and cold inside, with old furniture and creaky floorboards. Earl showed us to our room and told us to make ourselves at home. He then left, saying he would return in the morning with an update on the car. We settled into the cabin, trying to make the best of the situation. As night fell, the unease we had been feeling all day turned into a palpable fear. We heard strange noises outside, like whispers and footsteps. But when we looked out the windows, there was nothing but darkness. We decided to stick together in the living room, hoping the comfort of each other's company would ease our fears. Hours passed, and the sounds outside grew louder and more distinct. We heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking around the cabin, but when we called out, there was no response. Suddenly, the front door burst open, and Earl stood there, a twisted smile on his face. He held a rusty old knife, and his eyes gleamed with a sinister light. Before we could react, Earl lunged at us, and chaos erupted. We fought back with everything we had, but Earl was surprisingly strong for his age. In the struggle, I managed to grab a heavy wrench and struck Earl on the head, knocking him out cold. We quickly tied him up with some old rope we found in the cabin and debated our next move. We couldn't stay in the cabin, but we had no way to call for help and no idea how far we were from civilization. We decided to wait until morning, hoping we could find a way to escape in the daylight. As we sat huddled together, we heard more noises outside, like someone or something was watching us. When dawn finally broke, we cautiously stepped outside. The forest was eerily quiet, and there was no sign of anyone else. We made our way back to the garage, hoping to find some means of escape. To our horror, we found the garage in a state of disarray. The car was still there, but it had been stripped for parts. Earl had clearly planned this all along. Desperation set in as we realized we were completely stranded. Just then, we heard a rustling in the bushes and saw a figure emerge. It was a young woman, dirty and disheveled, with a look of terror in her eyes. She told us she had been held captive by Earl for days, and there were others in the woods who were part of his twisted game. We knew we had to get out of there, and fast. With the woman's help, we found a hidden path that led to a main road. We ran for what felt like hours, fear driving us forward. Finally, we stumbled upon a small town and managed to find help. We called the police, who later informed us that Earl was part of a notorious group of criminals who lured unsuspecting travelers into the woods to rob and kill them. We were lucky to have escaped with our lives, but the experience left us scarred. To this day, I can't drive through a remote area without feeling a chill run down my spine. The road trip that was supposed to be a fun adventure turned into a nightmare that haunts us both. And while the memories fade with time, the terror we felt that night will stay with us forever. Another creepy story has come to an end. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and if you have a story that's even more terrifying, send it over. And always remember, the real monsters hide in plain sight. This is Mr. Scary Guy saying, sleep well.